I rang my solicitor on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the new owners moved into my old house in Ballarat, and I told him exactly what I'd found. He went quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that costs $240 an hour, and then he said, "Raymond, you need to come in today." I already knew what was waiting for me. I'd known for longer than I was willing to admit. But it wasn't until a stranger called me about a letter left behind in the study that everything I'd suspected finally had a name. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a secondary school principal. 31 years of watching people, reading rooms, noticing the small things that others assumed went unnoticed. A flicker of the eyes before a lie. A pause that lasts half a second too long. I retired 4 years ago. Sold the schoolhouse in Ballarat where my wife Elaine and I had raised our 2 children and moved into a smaller place in the Geelong suburb of Newtown, closer to the bay, quieter. Elaine had passed from ovarian cancer 14 months before the move, and the Ballarat house had become too large for one person and too full of the wrong kind of silence. My daughter Patrice was 38. She lived in Melbourne with her husband Dominic and their son, my grandson Luca, who was 9 years old and who thought I hung the moon, which I considered my greatest professional achievement. My son Stuart was 41, unmarried, working in logistics in Brisbane. Stuart called every Sunday without fail. Patrice called when she needed something. I want to be fair to her, even now. She was not always the way she became. There was a time before Dominic when Patrice would ring me on a Wednesday night just to talk, when she'd drive down to Geelong on a long weekend simply because she felt like it. She was a warm person once. I believe the warmth is still somewhere inside her. I just no longer believe it is directed at me. Dominic Farrell arrived in her life 9 years ago. He was charming in the way that people are charming when they are performing charm rather than possessing it. He had an answer for everything. He laughed at his own jokes a half second before anyone else, as if he needed to signal that a joke had been made. He worked in property development, always one deal away from the big one, always explaining why the last deal had fallen short through no fault of his own. He called me Ray from our second meeting, which I corrected once, politely. Elaine had seen through him within the year. She never said it directly. That was not her way, but she asked me once, sitting at the kitchen table with her cup of tea, "Do you think Patrice is happy? Or do you think she's decided to be happy?" I told her I didn't understand the difference. She said, "One of them is real." I understood what she meant. I just didn't know yet what to do with it. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in March. I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the summer tomatoes when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Cheryl Mossop. She and her husband had purchased my old house in Ballarat, had been living there for 3 days. She sounded pleasant but slightly awkward, the way people sound when they're not entirely sure they're doing the right thing. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I'm sorry to bother you. We were moving some things around in the study, and we found a letter behind the built-in bookshelf. It must have slipped down the back. It's got your name on it, your full name and your old address. Handwritten. It looks, I don't know how to explain this, it looks like it was hidden there on purpose. I didn't want to just throw it out without telling you." I thanked her. I told her I'd arranged to collect it. I said I was sorry for the inconvenience. I stood in the backyard for a long time after I hung up, holding a tomato that had gone soft at one end. I thought about the study. I thought about who had been in that study in the 12 months before I sold the house. I thought about the weekend Patrice and Dominic had come to stay last April, the ostensible purpose being to help me sort through things before the sale. I thought about how many hours Dominic had spent in that study, supposedly helping me organize paperwork, while Patrice kept me occupied in the kitchen or the garden. I had known then that something was wrong. I had not known the shape of it. Now, I was beginning to see the outline. Let me go back to that April weekend. Because it matters. Patrice had suggested it. She rang in late March and told me it was getting too much for one person. Going through Elaine's things, deciding what to keep and what to donate, sorting the paperwork before putting the house on the market. She was right about that. It was too much. I had been avoiding the study in particular because it contained, among other things, Elaine's final letters, things she had written in the last weeks of her life and given to me in a sealed envelope, which I was not yet ready to open. It also contained, in the bottom drawer of the oak desk, Elaine's original handwritten will. We had a formal will on file with our solicitor, of course, but Elaine had written a second, personal document, not legally binding, but morally significant, in which she expressed her wishes regarding her jewelry, her art collection, her personal correspondence, and a specific savings account she had established in her own name during the last 2 years of her life. She called it her quiet account. It contained just over $90,000. She had told me about the quiet account 6 weeks before she died. She told me she intended it for Luca's university education, and that she had written her wishes down and placed them in the study. She asked me to honor them when the time came. I told her I would. It was one of the last real conversations we had. I had never mentioned the quiet account or the handwritten document to anyone. Not to Stuart, not to Patrice, or so I believed. During the April weekend, I noticed a few things. They were small things, the kind that a person who spent 30 years watching teenagers attempt to hide misbehavior learns to catalog without appearing to. On the Saturday morning, I came back inside from checking the mail earlier than expected and found Dominic in the study with the bottom drawer of the desk open. He closed it quickly and said he was looking for a stapler. There was a stapler on the desk, in plain sight. I said nothing. On the Sunday afternoon, Patrice asked me whether I'd thought about what would happen to Mum's savings after the house sold. She phrased it casually, as if it had just occurred to her. I said I hadn't decided yet, she said, in a tone so rehearsed I could hear the seams. Of course, you know, we've had some financial pressure lately. Dom's project in Tarnite didn't quite how it goes. I said I understood. I made tea. After they left that Sunday evening, I went to the study. The handwritten document was still in the bottom drawer. I checked it against my memory of how it had been folded. It had been unfolded and refolded not perfectly, not the way Elaine had folded it, with the precise horizontal thirds that were her habit. Someone had read it. I took the document to my bedroom and placed it inside a different envelope, inside a different drawer. Then I rang my solicitor, Marcus, not to report anything but simply to ask a general question about the legal standing of handwritten documents in estate matters in Victoria. He gave me a general answer. I thanked him and filed the information away. I did not confront Patrice. I did not mention it to Dominic. I am a patient man. I spent 31 years managing situations that required me to know more than I showed. The most effective response to suspicion is rarely the loudest one. In the months that followed, I watched. Patrice began calling more frequently, which might have felt like warmth, had I not understood by then that it was reconnaissance. She asked about the house sale timeline. She asked whether I had spoken to a financial advisor. She asked, twice, in different conversations, whether I had sorted out Mum's paperwork. Each time I told her things were in progress. Each time, she sounded slightly dissatisfied. Dominic came alone once, in June. While Patrice was supposedly at a conference, he arrived unannounced, a thing he had never done while Elaine was alive, because Elaine had made clear in the gentle, immovable way of hers that unannounced visits were not welcome. He said he was passing through Geelong on his way back from a site visit in Torquay. He brought a bottle of wine. He was too friendly, in the way that people are too friendly when they want something. He spent 20 minutes of the visit talking about Luca, how much Luca loved me, how much Luca needed stability, how important family was in uncertain times. I poured the wine and listened. I did not tell him that I had already spoken to a child welfare solicitor 2 weeks earlier as a precautionary measure, just to understand my rights regarding my grandson. I did not tell him a great many things. The house sold in September. Settlement was in November. In October, while the Ballarat house was in its final weeks of my possession, I made one last trip to go through the remaining items. I was systematic. I cleared every shelf, opened every drawer, looked behind every piece of furniture. I thought I had left nothing behind, but I had left one thing behind, in a place I had not thought to check. In my study, behind the built-in bookshelf that ran floor to ceiling along the east wall, there was a narrow gap where the shelf unit met the wall. I had used that gap, many years earlier, to store a spare envelope, the kind of envelope that might slip from a shelf and fall without being noticed. A letter I had written to myself 14 months ago, in the week after Elaine's funeral, when grief had made me want to put into words what I knew, and what I feared, and what I intended to do about it. It was the kind of letter a person writes and does not send. I had forgotten it was there. Cheryl Mossop sent it to me by registered post, in a padded envelope, with a handwritten note that said she hoped I was well and that she and her husband were very happy in the house and that the garden was beautiful. I read her note twice. Then, I opened my own letter. I had written it to myself on a Wednesday night in December, 2 years prior, 6 weeks after the funeral, 3 weeks after I had found a spreadsheet open on my laptop that I had not opened, containing a detailed breakdown of my assets, including the Ballarat property valuation, the superannuation balance, and itemized separately, with a question mark beside it, E's private account, confirm amount. The laptop had been left in the kitchen. The only people who had been in the house that week were Patrice and Dominic, who had stayed for 4 days to help me through the worst of it. My letter to myself laid it out plainly, what I had seen, what I suspected, what I had decided to do. It was also, I realize now, the document that Dominic had been looking for in April, not the handwritten will. He had known about the will because Patrice had told him. What he wanted was evidence that I knew. What he wanted to confirm was whether I had written anything down. The answer, it turned out, was yes, and it had spent 4 months in the gap behind a bookshelf in a house that no longer belonged to me. I rang Marcus that same afternoon. He listened, without interrupting, which is one of the things I value about him. Then he said, "You'd better come in." I came in the following Monday. I brought the letter, a copy of the spreadsheet I had photographed on my phone before deleting the file from the browsing history so that nothing appeared disturbed, and a written summary of every conversation with Dominic and Patrice that I had found suspicious in the preceding 14 months. I had been keeping notes since January. 31 years in schools teaches you to document everything. Marcus reviewed it all. He looked up once, over his glasses, and said, "Raymond, did you know this was going to happen?" I said, "I suspected it was possible. I hoped I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," he said. What Marcus found, working with a forensic accountant over the following 6 weeks, was this. Dominic had made 2 attempts to access information about Elaine's estate through a third party, a contact in financial services who had run an informal inquiry on my assets, using information that could only have come from inside my household. The inquiry had occurred in February of that year, 2 months after the funeral. Additionally, Patrice had contacted the public trustee's office in March, making informal inquiries about the process for contesting a will on grounds of diminished capacity. She had not lodged anything formally. She had, however, made the inquiry. She had made that inquiry 4 days after a phone call in which she had asked me, for the first time, whether I was managing all right and whether I had thought about getting some support for my memory, because she had noticed I seemed a bit scattered lately. I had not seemed scattered. I had a perfect memory of every word of that conversation, including the pause before scattered that told me the word had been chosen in advance. They were building a case. A slow, patient, deliberate case. They were going to argue, eventually, that I was not of sound mind, that the grief had affected my capacity, and use that argument to challenge the distribution of Elaine's estate, including the quiet account, and potentially my own assets as well. Dominic's Tarneet project had failed. They needed money, and they had decided, somewhere along the way, that the most efficient source of that money was me. I did not confront Patrice immediately. Marcus advised patience. The forensic accountant needed time. The process required precision. I spent those 6 weeks doing what I always did. I answered Patrice's calls. I asked after Luca. I told Dominic the garden at the Geelong house was coming along nicely when he asked. I gave no indication that anything had changed. What had changed was this. Marcus had engaged a barrister. The financial services contact had been reported to the relevant regulatory body. The documentation was being compiled. A formal letter was being prepared. It was delivered on a Thursday, in late April, to Dominic's registered business address and to the couple's shared home in Melbourne. I do not know exactly what Dominic's face looked like when he read it. I can only imagine. It detailed the findings. It made clear that any further attempts to access or influence the estate would result in immediate legal action. It named Patrice as a party to the inquiry. Patrice rang me that Thursday evening. I let the call go to voicemail. Her message was 11 minutes long. She cried. She said she didn't know it had gone that far. She said Dominic had told her it was just exploring options. She said she was sorry. She said she loved me. She said she didn't want to lose me. I listened to the message twice. There was real distress in her voice. I believe she was genuinely sorry. Sorry, at least, that it had been discovered. Whether she was sorry for the thing itself, I cannot tell you. I am not certain she can tell you either. That is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about my daughter. She is not a wicked person. She is a person who made a series of choices while telling herself a story that made those choices acceptable, and then found herself at the end of a path she had not fully intended to walk. I have not yet replied to her message. I have, however, called Luca. I call him every Wednesday evening. He told me last week that he'd come first in his class in a maths test, and that he wanted to show me when I come to visit. I told him I was proud of him. I told him I'd be there in June. I meant it. The quiet account is intact. Elaine's wishes will be honored. Luca will go to university on his grandmother's love, even if she is not here to see it. That is what I promised her. I am not a man who breaks his promises. Marcus tells me the regulatory matter is proceeding. Dominic has retained his own solicitor. There may be further proceedings. I am prepared for them. I have all my notes. Stuart rang on Sunday, as he always does. I told him a version of what had happened. Not everything. Not yet, but enough. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I told him I wasn't sure, at first, that I had enough to tell. He said, "You always taught us that the truth doesn't need to rush. It just needs to arrive." I had said that. I had said it to a Year 9 class in 2003 during a discussion about a novel in which a character waits too long to speak. I had not remembered that Stuart was listening. The tomatoes came out late this year. The soil in Geelong is different from Ballarat, heavier, damper, slower to warm in spring. But the crop was better than last year. I've started on a second raised bed along the south fence. Elaine always said I'd have more time to garden when I retired. She was right about most things. I think about what I want people to understand from what happened to me. Not for my sake, I have Marcus. I have Stuart. I have Luca and his Wednesday calls, and I have the particular steadiness that comes from having spent 31 years watching human nature at close range and discovering that most of it is survivable. I think about the other people like me, the ones who are, right now, in the early stages of what I went through. The ones who have noticed something small, a drawer left open, a conversation that lasted 2 beats too long, a question asked in a tone that doesn't quite match the words. If there is one thing I would say to those people, it is this: notice it. Do not explain it away out of love or loyalty, or the exhausting human need to believe that the people who should be good to you are, in fact, good to you. Notice it. Write it down. Keep your own records. Your memory is not evidence until you make it evidence. And if the person you suspect is someone you love, that is not a reason to stop noticing. It is a reason to be more careful. Grief makes us vulnerable in ways we do not fully understand while we are in it. It softens the edges of our judgment. It makes us want to be held. And sometimes we allow ourselves to be held by the very people who are watching to see whether we'll let our guard down. This is not weakness. It is human, but it can be protected against. If you are paying attention, family is not defined by blood. It is defined by what people do when they think you are not watching. Elaine knew that. She told me, in her way, without ever saying it plainly. She asked me whether Patrice was happy, or whether she had decided to be happy. She saw what she saw. She left behind a quiet account for a grandson she adored, and she trusted me to make sure it reached him. That trust is the thing I have worked hardest to be worthy of. Not my own grief, not my own anger, her trust. I'm going to open her sealed letter soon. I've been waiting until I felt ready. I think, finally, I might be ready. The house is quiet in the evenings now, a different kind of quiet from the one I first moved into, the heavy kind. This quiet is lighter. It belongs to me. I'll make a cup of tea, sit in the armchair by the window where I can see the bay when the weather is clear, and I'll read what she wrote. Whatever it says, I'll be all right. I always am. Before you go, this story is a fictional narrative created for storytelling purposes, but the question at the heart of it is real. If someone you loved let you down the way Patrice did, would you leave the door open or close it for good? Leave an A or a B. In the comments, I read every single one.